I began working on Kenzo Tange in 2005, just 2 months after Professor Tange had passed away. And I continued working on it for several years. I was very privileged to work, to have the opportunity to work on his archive. And in 2011, there was a series of fairly important exhibitions as well as publications related to Tange and the metabolist movement. It was at that moment, after a few years of working on Tange and metabolism, that I started to have a sense that for a more comprehensive, a more complete understanding of Japanese architecture culture in the last 50, 60 years, just looking at Tange and looking at metabolism was not enough. And it became quite easy and perhaps reasonable for me to go in many ways to the opposite of that stance in terms of architecture. The work of Kazuo Shinohara represented the antithesis, the opposite of a lot of the values, a lot of the methodologies that were embraced by Japan's avant-garde architects in the post-war period. In this exhibition, we're very happy and proud to present 100 questions, in fact, 100 what's called aphorisms from Professor Shinohara. 100 aphorisms from Professor Shinohara. Amongst these, quite a few of them were, as we can see here, immediately identifiable as his clear rejection of metabolism and that sense of a techno-rationalist approach to both to the house, to the building, and to the city. Aphorisms, questions such as, a house is a work of art, and a house must be beautiful. The idea of a house can be made in terms of multiples. I mean, that I think is really one of the interesting features of Professor Shinohara's writings in that period. Many metabolist architects were interested in, for instance, capsule houses or other domestic housing solutions that are meant for mass reproduction, for industrial production. The idea of multiple, that a house perhaps could be replicated in 5 copies, in 20 copies. And this is in fact part of the exhibit here at the exhibition. In fact, a series of originals or really prototypes that Professor Shinohara proposed at the 1964 exhibition he did together with the artist Setsu Asakura. He said, well, yes, houses in fact could be replicated, but the artistic value of the house is still important. And he would still approach the replication or the multiplicity of works of housing as works of art. So he borrowed this idea from artists, so that even though there could still be this possibility of perhaps a wider distribution, for him, the artistic value was paramount. So indeed, in Japanese architecture community in the 1950s, particularly the period between 1954 and 1958, it's often referred to as the period of the so-called tradition debate. So it was really in that period when Professor Shinohara's career was launched. He was a student in the laboratory of Professor Kiyoshi Seikei, who was very much interested in Japan's ancient residential scale architecture, in this idea of the homogeneity of space as found in the ancient Heian period, in the so-called Shinden style of residential architecture. For instance, a lot of Japan's imperial palaces and some Shinto as well as Buddhist, Buddhist temple architectures were built in this Shinden style. And part of this idea of Shinden for Professor Seikei was this idea of flexibility, this idea of horizontality, of movement, and also the fluidity of spaces from one pavilion into other and connected by these very relaxed connections. And that was really the context where Professor Shinohara received his training and education. And in many ways, his debut work, The House in Kugayama, is expressed clearly is expressed clearly in that sense, in that ethos of the tradition debate of the 1950s. But there was also this early house in Tokyo's Kugayama district was followed by a fairly long pause in his professional career. Perhaps the longest pause that we'll see until the very end, until his retirement from teaching at Tokyo Institute of Technology. It was a pause about 3 to 4 years. His next houses were not built until 1957, until 1958. And already in that interim, we started to see that the general interest in tradition started to change. And a very important movement that started to replace this interest in classical architecture, in the architecture of Heian period, Japanese classical period aristocracy, was this interest in Minka, in the architecture of the everyday for the commoners. So it was really that period when this kind of epistemic shift happened in how young Japanese architects started to think about their relationship to tradition. That's going to be different from the approach, from the method followed by Professor Seike or Professor Tange. This is also very much mirrored in the writings that Professor Shinohara was starting to produce in that period, starting in the late 50s. He was more interested in some of the more acts of living. He was interested in how commoners in Japan really lived, and certain prototypes of domestic dwellings that had to do with the very roots of how architecture emerged in Japan as well as the world from the very ancient times, and how certain kind of activities, what we call basic performative aspects of living, how people engage with the floor, how people engage with walls, how people engage with windows and the space around them. What are the kind of fundamental bodily as well as sensorial or even intellectual engagements with the space around us? He was interested in examining the kind of deepest roots of housing, of residential architecture. And Minka, of course, provided a very important clue in terms of how we can invent, how there's the possibility of creating a new engagement with tradition, while firmly remaining in the rubric of modernist architecture. Professor Shinohara was committed to the modernist project throughout his entire architectural career, but he was also interested in how to activate it, how to regenerate, to give new life to modernism through these various clues, going to the fundamentals of housing and going to the fundamentals, to the very deepest roots of architecture. I think there are two levels in which we can comprehend the current international interest in the architecture of Professor Shinohara. On one level is when we look at the contemporary scene of Japanese architecture, especially younger generations who have been active in the last 20, 30 years. I think it's fair to say that many of them were influenced indirectly or directly in some cases by the teachings, by the works of Professor Shinohara. So that's one level. So in many ways, it's about kind of tracing the origins of the contemporary of Japanese architecture. On the other hand, I think there is this point of Shinohara's architecture having certain universal values. And I like to say this because these are values, again, because of his firm commitment to the modernist project. He was interested in bring in fundamental values, bring in the roots of architecture that are perhaps many of which are truly global and universal to humanity. It's not just about Japan. There's some perhaps picturesque or even superficial elements that speak to visually to a Japanese tradition, but certain things like I want my living space to be as vast as possible, or I'm interested in the darkness and the comfort of black spaces. These are universal human human pursuits of comfort, of what it means to be a house, a home. And Professor Shinohara, through his writings, through his architectural production, made some very strong, clear, polemical statements in terms of how these fundamental values of architecture and housing should be approached. And I think that is also the global value, the international relevance of Shinohara's architecture to our time. This exhibition here, in collaboration with Professor Okuyama, as well as Professor Kaijima, together with Dr. Ogura, we had this opportunity perhaps to, in a sense, to look at both the beginning and the end. So the gallery on the third floor is focused on what's been happening in recent years, which has to do with the earlier, particularly timber frame structures, houses designed by Professor Shinohara that for various reasons either had to be relocated or refurbished. And it's really a wonderful opportunity to look at these earlier works again through these renovation, refurbishment, relocation projects, how we have been able to introduce again new life to these houses, and to follow again one of Professor Shinohara's most famous aphorisms, that a house is here forever, this idea of eternity that he hoped to endow in these works of art, not this temporary technical functionalist solutions. And once we go up to the fourth floor gallery, Gallery 2, we see two important works from the very end of his career. One was a house and studio that he designed for himself after he had retired from Tokyo Institute of Technology. And this is very much an emblematic work for Professor Shinohara's fourth style, when he was very much interested in how, in terms of perhaps the incidence of different geometries, how different geometries collide into each other to form new machines for living. We're very fortunate to be able to display the original drawings and sketches made by Professor Shinohara for his very last unbuilt project, a small cottage for his own family in the mountains to the west of Tokyo, in Tateshina. So the main exhibit itself really, I think, highlights both the beginning and the end of Professor Shinohara's career, but at the same time, the selection of the 100 questions or 100 aphorisms from Professor Shinohara again lends a strong sense of this contemporary relevance of Shinohara's architecture. We were able to engage also 100 different young Japanese architects in terms of asking for provoking them with these applications by Shinohara, and trying to learn from them as to what is, again, this question of the current meaning, the contemporary significance of all these wonderful ideas proposed by Professor Shinohara.